Our first game, is Bionic Commando, which was nominated by @abadcurrent on Twitter, and I think he just nominated like in the last day or so, which is cool. So,
did he specify the version, or are we just picking it ourselves?
Well, I'm pretty sure he meant the NES version. Like, he actually had something interesting to say, which is he felt like it was a game that hit, like, on our little chart. You know, we have the chart of all the criteria we use to rank games, and like there's the bad side and the good. He felt like it hit pretty much like every circle on there in both sides. So I think he might be a little bit younger than me, or she actually. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, this is one of those games that like it's hard for me to look at objectively, because as a kid I loved it, and that is one of our criteria, is that I played it as a kid, therefore it's good. But what do you guys think? Like, who's the youngest among us and who does not have the rose-colored glasses on for this one?
I guess that'd be me. That's my job.
Tell me, how does it feel to be the furthest from death from like out of the four of us?
Not if I can help it.
I'm going to live longer so far as I'm still stuck in rural PA.
Well,
so.
I'm still American. I'm not doing that great.
Yeah, exactly.
First world problems amongst us.
But yeah, so has Bob played the original Bionic Commando?
A little bit, yes. And longtime GCNX fans might remember we also played the Game Boy Color sequel reimagining.
Yeah.
Forces.
The denazified version, right?
But yeah, I am familiar with the original and the Game Boy version.
It's one of the Famicom version is one of the few games to have the name Hitler in the title, right?
Do you want to quickly sum up what the hell Bionic Commando is?
Okay, so Bionic Commando, we're talking about the NES version, but it was also an arcade game, which was pretty much different, but they both have something in common, which is that the character cannot jump, and instead of jumping, what you have is this bionic arm, which kind of extends like a grappling hook and latches onto most but not all surfaces in the game, and it allows you to kind of swing back and forth, and it also is a game that has kind of slightly like quasi-linear gameplay or quasi-non-linear gameplay. I don't know. Like there's like a map and you can kind of move back and forth and kind of pick your path to the ending. It's kind of a pseudo sequel to the Capcom arcade classic Commando in that I think you're trying to rescue the hero from Commando, Super Joe, I believe.
Yep.
Not that really has anything to do with the game itself.
There was also an arcade version. Sorry, go ahead.
Right, yeah. The arcade version, I remember having a lot more like bees than I thought was.
Yeah.
There's a lot and stuff.
It's a lot harder to control. The arm was longer but less wieldy. It felt more sluggish.
Totally different visual style.
No one likes the arcade version.
It's really pretty unremarkable, even I gotta say.
Yeah.
No.
It's worth playing just to see how far you can go on just that grappling hook mechanic, because
key to the whole game and franchise.
Right. I mean, the franchise such as it is, there's like barely any of them. So after that, they had a Game Boy version, then they had a Game Boy Color version, which we talked about on one of our Game Club 1990X episodes. And then since then, there's been Bionic Commando Rearmed, which is like a remake of the NES game.
Yep.
And then there's the Bionic Commando straight up like modern
Bionic Commando Reamed.
Yeah.
With Faith No More's Mike Patton as Nathan Rad Spencer, the protagonist, which I did not hate, but it was... Yeah, the plot wasn't great, and it was pretty rough in some areas. I thought it had a lot of promise, but...
I think it's kind of dumb that they made his first name Nathan instead of Rad, because, I mean, Rad had, I believe... had 2 Ds at the end, right?
Yeah.
That was supposed to be his name. I just thought it was
they were trying not to be obvious about the fact that he was named Rad, so they're like, let's add an extra D. That was subtle.
We gotta name him something. How about we call him Rad Spencer? Well, that's too crazy. Let's make it Rad with 2 Ds so people won't be too weirded
Maybe it was
out.
Lad. I mean, it's possible.
It was actually spelled...
Yeah, that's more likely.
It actually said as Lad in the ending scene to NES Bionic, which I suppose is our main game talking about here, and it is my favorite Capcom game of all time. I'm not kidding.
That is a tall order, my friend.
I've been playing this one since I was like, 3 or 4. I just
3 or 4?
yeah. No. I got into games really young. I was playing low.
Just like endlessly plummeting Rand Spencer into like the very first pit you found. Like, what kind of 3-year-old?
If it makes you feel better, I was playing Street Fighter 2 when I was that age. So
yeah, but you can play Street Fighter 2 and enjoy it without having any. Like, you can just like leave the controller on the floor and just watch your character get his ass kicked, and it will be amusing to a 3-year-old. There's no way as a 3-year or even 4.
Satenga can't be like a gaming prodigy? What is this?
Look, I'm not saying it's. No,
I have beaten Battletoads.
That's not possible. You're. There's no way you were doing that.
You don't have to necessarily play it well. I mean, you can just take in the sights.
Not even do it. Look,
if we're talking about death, can we at least mention Hitler's exploding head?
Right. So at the end of the game, get all the way to the end, and you're collecting extra weapons and stuff like that, and being, so there's like, powering up. It's got all the things that we nowadays look back and think of as the great, characteristics of great NES games. But when you get all the way to the end, you find out that the bad guys' plans, and I believe the bad guys are, in the North American version at least, are just called the Bads.
Yeah, BADD, because they didn't want to outright call them Nazis. Yeah, they didn't want to
something ADD. So you get all the way to the end, you find out that their secret plan was to resurrect Hitler, and so he's in like some kind of like supercopter or something at the end. I can't remember what that thing is supposed to be.
Yeah, well, you have to blow up his like death weapon, the Albatross, which is this giant laser turret, and then he tries to escape in a chopper, which you have only like one shot to hit, or else its machine gun instantly kills you. Right,
and so you're supposed to shoot your bazooka right into the through the canopy, I guess, of the helicopter, and then you're treated to an animation of Hitler's 8-bit head exploding very slowly.
That's
like with an eyeball popping out and everything. Like, it looks like something out of Rise of the Triad, to be honest. Like, it's exactly what it looks like. In fact, the game is
flying eyeball and everything.
You could feel like Rise of the Triad was some kind of like weird pseudo prequel to Bionic Commando in a way.
Well, it's going to be a Wolfenstein prequel, and they both have Hitler, so...
Right, yeah,
QED.
It's crazy.
What I'd like to point out is that the remake, Bionic Rearmed, they absorbed a higher rating just to keep that death scene in there in full detail.
Yeah, they made it even gorier, too.
Because, the game's not violent, it's just...
Insane. Though, like, I mean, honestly, if you're making a remake of NES Bionic Commando, like, you have already, like, there's no kid who's going to be playing that game. It is for people over the age of 26 at the youngest.
It's a bit of a shame. It's a very good remake, very solid.
It is. It's very cool. And then they had like a kind of like expansion pack sequel to it, right?
Well, people don't really talk about 2 as much for some reason. Was that bad?
It's totally new levels on that one. They're not based on the NES game, as I recall.
It was a new game, and people didn't have the direct nostalgia for it, so they just kind of ignored it.
But if you really had nostalgia for the game, you should love something like that, because it's like, I love the game, but I played it so many times that you could play it again, and it's got.
Well, did our 3-year-old Bionic Commando player? Did he play the second remake?
Believe it or not, I haven't gotten to Rearm 2 past the demo, and it doesn't seem to be coming onto Steam.
You're young yet. You still have it.
Okay, how did my age become? I mean, I'm older than Bob, for God's sake. Here,
no, just
that's not the point. The point is, you said you were playing Bionic Commando when you were 3 years old.
Man, I don't think we talked about the game enough yet, though. If I just want to give a quick assessment, it's relatively lengthy because there are like 12 areas to explore, and the game, I think, is really a masterwork for the NES design. I mean, it does have a fair difficulty spike here and there. Area 6 especially requires you to make like 4 consecutive swings on really small platforms. It has to be really precise and perfect. But
it's a difficult game. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, those darn laser cannons in Area 10.
Yeah, there's a lot of the swinging stuff, and yeah, you're right. Towards like the later stages, you're like kind of swinging from like little tiny posts or something, or like searchlights or something like that. And it's very right.
Yeah, although to be fair, in the latter half of the game, you do have the considerably broken rocket launcher, but I guess the problem becomes more with platforming than killing the enemies, and the rocket launcher is not going to help you make that precise swing above a fire pit or what have you. But yeah, really, I think the game's atmosphere is unmatched. I still get chills when the final area music plays. It has a very, commanding sort of sense to it. I don't know how to describe it.
Like, what is the thing that really sets this game apart? Because, I mean, we're already talking about it in this is very high praise for an NES game. And, what do you think really... What really makes it great? Like, if you could nail it, boil it down to one thing.
I'd say it's partly the ARM for being a very original idea on a platformer that they hadn't really seen before. But I'd also say that it's kind of like the adventure elements that make it more interesting. Having to collect items and make further progress, going to communication rooms for hints, that kind of thing.
That's cool. Yeah, that's a good thing to mention, is the communication rooms. So there's like a lot of weird stuff where you can go, like, you're supposed to be like not a secret agent, but more like you are a commando, right? So you're like infiltrating enemy territory, and so like you can sneak into buildings and tap into their communications, listen in on conversations. They have little like dudes' heads who pop up like Metal Gear codec conversations for some reason, and you can like talk to like other like secret agents who are hiding among the bad guys. And it doesn't really do that much, but it is kind of cool because it adds like a extra layer of sort of...
Well, I mean, you basically made the point that this game, especially for an NES game, does an extremely good job of delivering exactly what it says it's going to be. You play as the Bionic Commando, and it sets itself up and feels like that. You get to swing around like a commando, you talk to all these guys like a commando. You've got some of the better NES music in the background, and it's well made. Yeah.
It is very well. I mean, it's for a game that's it's the first game I can think of that has the grappling hook mechanic that kind of became not a mainstay of platformers for sure, but something definitely that you see pop up later in other games like.
Doesn't Caverns of Kafka have the kind of grappling hook mechanic?
Not the same thing, and I don't want to get into that, but it's with Bionic Commando, it's more like for such a... This is what I think sets Capcom apart in these early days, is that they could make a game like DuckTales or Bionic Commando or
Mega Man. No, you're thinking Mega Man.
That's what I meant. They could make a game like that has this, especially Bionic Commando or DuckTales, that has this really unique mechanic to it that is not really found in many other games, and certainly wasn't found in any games up to that point in the same way. And build a game around it that feels not only
like it was made for the mechanic,
right? That feels like they really thought it through, and they went back and replayed the levels and changed them and tweaked them to make it easier for people to... Not easier, I mean, they're still challenging, but made it easier to make your way around. It's like very few parts of the game do you feel like you're stuck. And compare that to a game like the NES Strider, which is also Capcom, but which was clearly not finished. And you see kind of the difference, whereas like Strider's a very similar game in a lot of respects, but there's a lot of times where you're playing that game, especially if you're playing it for the first time, where you're like, what the hell am I supposed to be doing here? And that just doesn't happen in Bionic Commando. You always kind of know what you're doing. You always feel... It's not too complicated. It's not too, it's hard, but it's not, in most places, it's not particularly unfair. I mean, would you agree with me, Satenga, on that?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, it has a distinct sort of curve to its levels. You can tell when it's going to get rough, but you practice enough at it, and, it feels manageable. None of the areas are, like, too gigantic. You can beat them in, like, average 3 to 4 minutes, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, once you know what you're doing, yeah, definitely not hard. I guess the one knock against it, I would say, is that the sprite art is kind of so-so. Like, what I appreciate about it is that they aren't doing the late NES game style where the sprite art has all these like defined black lines, and they use fewer colors so they can have those like clear cartoonish lines. it's still like the early style sprite art that you see in like, you know, Super Mario Brothers and Zelda and stuff like that. But
well, I think if I remember correctly with the art, they do a pretty good job of not like flickering and stuff. I think they keep it so that it's quite a stable game visually. They don't fill it with projectiles and
yeah,
stuff.
it doesn't look bad. I think it's more that like it doesn't have the same, because they're going for this kind of pseudo-realistic or somewhat realistic military setting in like the not so distant future, that kind of thing. It kind of drags the game down a bit because with the 8-bits,
it is unremarkable. I can't remember what it looks like.
But other than that, that's really the only knock I can. That's the only bad thing I can say about the game. That's it. So should we rank this sucker?
About time, yeah.
How would you guys feel between Alien Soldier and Space Harrier?
I don't know. I sort of felt it would be higher, to be perfectly honest. I wasn't sure.
Listen, I'm going to be incredibly biased. Due to nostalgia, I would place this one at the very top, even beating out Toe Jam and Earl. However, with the proviso that,
Can I ask why you'd think it's better than Mario Land 4? Just curious.
I just don't know how Alien Soldier ended up below those, because I'm not sure if I would put it above Alien Soldier, but I'd probably put it above the rest of them.
I'd say that it's easier to figure out than the sometimes obtuse Wario Land 4 can be. I think it flows smoother, it has more consistency in its design, and, well...
It's undeniably one of the best and most defining games of the NES. I think that's true. And being that way, I do think it should be definitely very high up there on the list.
But putting it at the very top, that just makes me feel like I'm clinging onto this on an objective scale. I don't know, Xerxes, what's your call here? I mean, overall, it's just a game that I feel so satisfied with beating every time. I mean, it ends with Hitler's head exploding, and then the base exploding, and then it feels like, you know, a real victory's been won. It's just got a really fine rise and denouement. It's just, I think, everything a video game should be, and because of the ARM, way different than other platformers of the time. Like, its identity is never going to be mistaken. There are some platformers that can be confused fairly easily on the NES. Like, there are like half a dozen Ninja games made for it, and like at least half of those you don't hear talked about nowadays. But there's no mistaking Bionic Commando. It's definable, and it is. Everyone knows it, so that's my reasoning.
All right, so I'm not really sure. Like, where do we have this? Really, I mean, I think it's definitely in the top 5. So right now, the top 5 are, I believe, Toe Jam and Earl, Wario Land 4, Galaga, Kicks, and Alien Soldier. I feel like you got to put it above Alien Soldier, just because Alien Soldier is really more of a perfection of an existing thing.
Yes,
you know, it's.
I think it goes to the top, to be perfectly honest.
Better than Toe Jam and Earl.
I think if you wanted me to say which game would you recommend, if I said pick one game, you don't know who you're recommending it to, I would probably go with Bionic Commando. It's a better encapsulation of games than Toe Jam and Earl, which it can be like, this game's too weird for me, I don't get it, I don't like it. It's confusing.
And those boogeymen are really obnoxious on higher levels.
I'll allow it.
So, I know that Bob's probably going to be outmoded here, and I do apologize, but
no, you don't have to apologize. This is democracy in action. So we've got Cal's vote for top of the list.
I think so. Yeah.
Bobinator's vote for not top of the list, I guess, for now. And Satenga, I didn't hear.
Top of the list, too.
Okay, so that means I'm the tiebreaker, at least in terms of top of the list. And this is a Hardcore Gaming 101 podcast first, but I'm going to disagree with Bobinator and say that I do think it deserves to be above Toe Jam and Earl, and I'll tell you why. It was actually something Cal said that really tipped me over the edge, and that was that if you were to take somebody who'd never played the NES and say, like, I'm going to give you an NES, I'm going to give you like 3 games or 5 games, let's say. Like, I mean, Bionic Commando would be one of them. It is like, it is, and because of the privacy of the NES Famicom as a game machine and like what it means to games historically, but also just like kind of it's like one of the totemic platforms. I think that you have to like give that up. Like the Toe Jam Earl's the same way in a way, because it's one of the games, like if I gave somebody a Genesis and said, here's a Genesis and here's 5 Genesis games that you have to play to say that you've, given the Genesis a shot. And Toe Jam Earl would probably be one of those too. But the thing about the Genesis is that like it's, and same with the Super Nintendo, by the way, this isn't like a pro Nintendo thing, but they're both kind of, those consoles were just doing what the NES did, but with more, like,
well, they were just they're the next generation of games. They're just
right. It's very few games on those consoles that couldn't be done on the NES, and that's fine. It's not like I'm just saying that, but you look at very early on, especially in like the development of the platformer as a genre or the action platformer or whatever you want to call it. Bionic Commando happened pretty early, and it really gets so much right with very little to go on. It's not really building on something so much as it is just inventing stuff whole cloth. And it gave us the grappling hook mechanic. Now, I mean, there might be another game that predates it that has some kind of grappling hook type thing. I mean, we mentioned Caverns of Kafka, but that doesn't really count because you're not swinging from it. It's just really a way of like clipping through walls and stuff to get those gems or something. But with Bionic Commando, I mean, I might be wrong about this, but it is, if it's not the first game to do a grappling hook swinging type thing, it is definitely the best game, the first game to get it right.
I would say it got it so right that games kind of didn't try it again for a long time because they're just like, well, we can't do better than that. So
yeah, I mean, maybe it's like, I also feel like it was kind of like a sleeper hit in its own way. Like it was a popular enough game that you could talk about it in those days, and people at least kind of know of it, if not, even if they hadn't played it. But it definitely kind of like, I recall its reputation really increasing a lot after kind of the NES had its heyday, and people would talk about, oh, this is a great NES game if you haven't played it, like Bionic Commando, you got to play Bionic. Like it was the kind of game that you would go back and dust off your NES to play if somebody loaned it to you, because I think that is actually the first time I played it was like into the 90s at some point, early 90s. Somebody loaned it to me, and so it was like one of those things like, get out the NES and play this. So right now, as of today, as of this moment, Bionic Commando for the NES, the best game of all time.